Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment or two. We're excited. The room is filling up with people, and we'll just give people a minute and a half or so to log on. While you're waiting for us to get started, please in the chat let us know where you're from and tell us what's your favorite thing about landscaping in Florida. What's your favorite thing about a Florida landscape? And we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Guy likes a low maintenance landscape. Can't argue with you there. Love the year-round color. Nice. Pollinators. We've got folks from a good representation from Central Florida so far. Got South Florida in. Good. Attracting wildlife. I like that. Native species. Very popular. Year-round growing. Love that. Your answers are coming in fast and furious. It's hard to keep up. Turf grass in moderation. I don't think too many people would argue with you on that. Things grow 3 times as fast and big. Nice. Parade of native blooms. I love it. And low maintenance. Good. Some nice, interesting answers there. And I'm so excited that y'all have been able to join us today. My name is Tom Wickman. I'm the Assistant Director of the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, and just excited that you're here and want to welcome you to our Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar Series. Today's webinar is High Performance Landscapes and the Metrics and Standards Used to Create Sustainable Landscapes with Dr. Gail Hansen. Your microphones are muted. We'll be closing the chat feature during the presentation, but please put any questions that you have during the presentation into the Q&A box, and we'll take those at the end of the presentation. This webinar is approved for 1 FFLCP, LIF, AICP, FDEX, LF, LCLM, LLO, and CLO, DBPR, LA, and CAM, and 1 FNGLA CEU. There's a $15 administration fee to receive a certificate for continuing education. I'll put a link in the chat box to make payment for the certificate if you've not already done so. We will submit for CEUs to the licensing agencies on Friday, so make sure if you want a CEU to make payment by the end of the day today. This is a part of a monthly webinar series held on the second Tuesday of the month at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Our next regularly scheduled webinar will be July 8th with Dr. Yi Lau talking about microclimates and mitigating the heat in Florida's cities. Also, you'll see a survey invitation pop up. Please take the time to fill out that survey. It's really important. It helps us determine what educational programs to offer for the coming year. Well, without any further delay, let me turn the mic over to Mark Celestin to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you very much, Tom. And good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar. Like Tom mentioned, my name is Mark Celestin, and I serve as the training manager for the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. We are thrilled to have join us today Dr. Gail Hansen to present the topic of high performance landscapes and the metrics and standards that can be used to create sustainable landscapes. So Dr. Hansen is a professor in the Department of Environmental or Horticulture and an extension specialist in sustainable landscape design. She's a guru. Her teaching and extension programs address sustainable, science-based, and art-centered landscape design practices that consider the social dimensions of green urban environments, environmental protection, and the quality of life for urban dwellers. Today, Dr. Hansen is going to be presenting on high performance landscapes, as mentioned before, and the metrics and standards used to create sustainable landscapes. It is my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Gail Hansen.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. So welcome, everyone. I think you know by now that we're going to be talking about high-performing landscapes today. And we're going to talk a little bit about the metrics and standards that you can use to measure those landscapes if you want to make them more sustainable, and also for more sustainable communities. So some of you may be familiar with high-performing landscapes with that term. If you're not, it's actually a pretty simple concept. It basically is a landscape that will fulfill the intended purpose. Like, why did you create that landscape, and what goals did you have for it? And it will fulfill those goals, but it also contributes to sustainability, because that is what is the hallmark of a high-performing landscape. It's highly sustainable. And it is also a landscape that meets your environmental, your social, and your economic goals. But the key is that you have to measure, have different metrics, but you have to have measurable outcomes in order for you to know if it is sustainable, and in order for you to know if you have reached your goals. So these are two documents here, the cover of two documents that have a ton of information about evaluating landscape performance. The first one in the center is the Landscape Architecture Foundation, LAF. It is they're kind of the gurus of evaluating landscape performance, and this is a guidebook that you can download from their website. And it tells you what metrics to choose, what methods to choose, and then how to go about evaluating a landscape. And the other one is a Sustainable Sites Initiative. It's guidelines and performance benchmarks, which are the same thing as the metrics. And that's from the American Society of Landscape Architecture. And it is also a document that you can download. These documents are probably used more often by professionals like landscape architects or land planners and so forth, but they also have a lot of good information for just, the regular yard, a homeowner, and their yard. One of the things why these high-performing landscapes became a lot more popular was because there are a lot of decision makers, owners, investors, people who work for municipalities, for different agencies, who have a lot invested in creating landscapes like city parks, city plazas, and developers, for example, with their large communities. And they are really interested in the return on investment. So before they propose to use taxpayer dollars to build a nice new park, they want to know and have some proof that the projects that they're funding will perform well and that their investments will pay off. So it has become more popular in that sense for, these decision makers. So the really critical thing about a high performance landscape is that you have measurable outcomes, and performance metrics are how you know how that landscape is performing. And I'm going to give you an example here. It's a real quick example. This is a man-built, human-built wetland. It may not look like a natural wetland, but it is actually a wetland, and it functions like a wetland. This is in Portland, Oregon. We took a tour years ago, and they have all sorts of really nice stormwater management facilities in Portland. And this one was really important. It was brand new, had just been put in. Their problem, their environmental problem that they were having, so that's the first thing you have to do is define what your problem is that this side of the street used to just be a swale. It was kind of a dirt and turf swale. And a high volume of stormwater would go racing down the hill, and down at the bottom here, down by the buildings, it would flood the lower level parking area of the building, which was a affordable housing unit. And so they needed to resolve that problem. First of all, they needed to manage the stormwater. So they brought in a designer and they said, hey, let's try to do a couple things here. Maybe we can build this flume here and we can have terraces going down with little weirs across, and we can slow down the volume of the water as it goes down these terraces, and more of the water will soak in and percolate down, and less of the water will end up at the bottom of the hill. And then they decided, while we're doing it, why don't we make this a nice walkable feature along here, because there were no sidewalks on this street. So two kind of problems, a social problem and an environmental problem that they were trying to solve with this. So basically, they managed the stormwater. They actually were looking to clean the runoff, and one of the metrics that they used was to take water samples and test that. They put in street trees for shade, and then they wanted a safe and pleasant walking area. So those were some of the things they wanted to measure. So they had to come up with ways to do that and set some metrics, like what are we going to measure, how are we going to measure them, and when. And I'm going to show you an analogy that I often use with my students when I'm, talking about these landscapes. So this is looking at being either a healthier human or having a healthier yard, or having both here. So I use this analogy because all of us have gone to the doctor, and we know about what happens at doctor visits. So you've seen this image before of all the inner workings of the human body. So that's a little ecosystem there by itself. So this person comes into the doctor's office and they say, hey, doc, I just want to be healthy. I want to be a healthier person. And they said, I really have some objectives. I want to be able to walk farther. I want to be stronger. I want to lose some weight. And I'd like to get off some of these medications that I'm on. So those are my objectives. And the doctor says, well, in order to do a before and after, and to see if you're improving and becoming healthier, we need to take some measures here. And they're going to look at your cardiovascular health, probably listen to your lungs. They'll, whoops, what happened here? Go in the wrong direction. They'll take your blood pressure, maybe take a blood draw, ask you about your joints, how they're working, and ask you about your diet. So then they'll send you off with a prescription, and they'll say, okay, eat less of this food, walk more every day, go to the gym and work out. And then when you come back, we'll look at all your lab work and everything that we did before, and we'll see what improved. And that way you'll know if you are now a healthier person or not. And the person themselves can say, hey, I could only walk 1 block and now I can walk 10, or I can lift a lot more weights, or, I've lost 20 pounds or whatever. So those are different metrics and ways of measuring to know if you are now a healthier person. You can do the same thing with the yard. You can say, you know what, I want a more sustainable, healthier yard. And, they're looking at their yard and they go out and they say, when I go out there, I don't see any pollinators. I don't see any butterflies. I don't see any bees. And I'm using way too much water in my yard. And I'd like to be able to, let's see if I can, yeah. I'd like to be able to spend more time out in my yard. I don't, because it's just not a good looking yard. And I'd like to attract more wildlife. And so then those are their objectives for their yard. And then they call in the expert, and the expert does a little investigation. They do an inventory and analysis similar to what a doctor did. And they said, hey, you've only got one tree, you need more trees. So let's plant more trees. You need more flowering plant material. You've got a lot of pests here. We need to take care of that. And maybe you want some edible plants in your yard. And maybe you'd like to have the little yard maintenance fairy come and visit your yard every once in a while. So then they go and they plant all this and they do everything, and then they come back and the homeowner says, hey, I can go out now and I see a lot more birds and butterflies and bees, and I'm spending a lot more time out in my yard because it looks a lot nicer and I'm not using as much water and I've got more critters in my yard. So that's just an analogy of how you can think of having a higher performing landscape or a higher performing human. So a few years ago, actually no, maybe only about a couple years ago, I wrote a document with the help of a bunch of students in my planting design class in the landscape architecture department. And we wrote this document, Standards for High Performing Landscapes. And we wrote it as a blueprint that anybody can use for writing community landscape standards. And in this, we used a case study with the Wildlight residential community up in Yulee, Florida, which is north of Jacksonville. I have been working with that community for a while, and I've written some landscape standard books for them. And, they needed some improvements there, so we used this community as a case study. And one of the things that we have in this document, which actually I think you can download from the Florida Friendly website, and or you can go to the Environmental Horticulture Department on the UF website. And if you find my picture underneath of it, you can click on a link and you can download this document. But in the document is this chart here, and it's one that we put together for performance data and metrics. And in the corner, we have the functional measures. So we went through and we made a list of things that you can measure in your yard using metrics of various kinds, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we linked them to design strategies. We said, okay, if somebody wants a more biodiverse yard, we can measure biodiversity. And one of the things that they can do is they can use the appropriate plant palette. So right plant, right place, or I'd like to say right plant every place. And that's one way that we can increase biodiversity. And this is what we kind of rank them in order of how many functional measures you could use when you're using these design strategies. So the right plants are very important. You can also have a lower maintenance yard. You can have wildlife conservation and habitat for wildlife. You can save water. It'll be more resilient to stressors like droughts or hurricanes or high winds. It can be better human habitat and more useful and productive, because if you put some of the plants are edible plants, it can also be more aesthetically pleasing, have high visual quality, because you have more plant material and it's more complex, more interesting, more textures and forms and so forth. And also greater number of ecosystem services like cooling the air, because you probably have more trees and shrubs and so forth. So that's one design strategy that has a lot of different functional measures for improvement to create a high performing landscape. You can also look at, make sure you plant in vertical layers, and then it shows, the icons show all the different functional measures that you can use with vertical layers, using a sustainable hardscape, using native and adapted plants, and all the way down, like incorporating landform. And people say, well, if how does that help? Well, if you create berms and you do lower areas for rain gardens and so forth, it can help you conserve water. It might attract more wildlife. It might be more resilient. Managing water on your site, using maybe cisterns and downspouts and so forth. Creating a sense of place, and then using all the way down to best irrigation design. So this is a list of the functional measures that you might be interested in improving your landscape with, and the design strategies for how you can do it. And then I'm going to talk about the metrics here. What can you measure with these functional measures? Biodiversity. Well, you can measure things like maybe the number of plants. You can measure volume of water, perhaps, for, one of these where you're going to have water conservation. You can measure time, and you can measure percent. And these are just a few of the ways you can use your metrics to know if you have what your landscape your before, and then what benefits you got after you made those improvements. So biodiversity, count the variety and number of plants. So variety and abundance. For low maintenance, keep track of the number of minutes that you spend maintaining your yard, and hopefully your outcome, your benefit, will be times saving. The number of insects, birds, and mammals that you have in your yard, you can count that. And hopefully then you will see that your outcome was you have more pollinators. Volume of water used or minutes that you irrigate, cost and water savings, resilience to stressors, number of plants that you lost during a drought or a freeze. Will save you, the outcome might be that you save replacement costs if you have drought hardy plants, or you don't use plants that are going to freeze in your location. Time spent in your yard, your outcome, better health. For useful and productive yard, the number of fruits and vegetables that you harvest could be a count, and your outcome would be cost savings and better health. So you can go all the way down all of these functional measures and say, this is what I'm going to count. This is, time spent, whatever. And this is the outcome. This is the benefit that I have now because, I have increased my plant material or my biodiversity in my yard. This table is also in that document. I'm not going to certainly go over the whole table, but I want to let you know that our process, the way that we came up with goals and measures that are related to high-performing landscapes, and this was my graduate students and I came up with this. We divided it into landscape standards, community influencer standards, and developer goals. Across the top, on the first row across the top, we listed all the goals we could think of that for landscape standards, like ecology goals, sustainable goals, plant qualities, your aesthetic preferences, placemaking, codes and policy, and maintenance goals. Then below each of those, there is a column, and it lists all the things that you can measure. Under ecology, you can measure biodiversity. You can measure whether it mimics regional ecology. You can measure water conservation or pollinator and wildlife habitat. So you can go down any one of these goals and you can see what you can measure. Over under community influences, we have user needs, social norms, cultural norms, and then some performance metrics. Again, those are the goals that you have to maybe, increase user needs or whatever. But then you can look and see different things that you can measure, activities you can do, and metrics that you can measure for each one. And if we look under the developer, of course, they usually have economic goals. They want to reduce their water costs. reduce their maintenance costs. They want to increase their property value, mitigate any storm damage, possible storm damage. And then the developer builder, they always have return on investment, their profit margins, the landscape costs and budget, the community property and community values. So this is just a big old table that if you don't know quite where to start, if you're thinking about if you can measure some standards in your landscape and you have some goals, this might help you if you look and you say, well, I want it to be more sustainable. So I'm going to look down that column, and these are some things that I can do and that I can measure. Also in that book, we have a lot of photographs to give you examples of what, metrics that you might use. So for residential site metrics for plant material, and this is not necessarily for the entire landscape, but we're just looking at plant material here. So one metric might be to use native and adapted plants. And in fact, a lot of times we'll say like 100% native and or adapted plants. Tree canopies have to cover at least 40% or more of the site. Ground cover, you need a mix of a minimum of 3 species on a larger site or 2 species on a small site. Same with shrubs. And also having this mix of vertical heights with trees, shrubs, and ground cover. So this may seem like a very low bar to only have at least minimum 2 species of ground cover and 2 of shrubs, but a lot in this development and a lot of new developments, you have to remember that the front yards are tiny, 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 like sometimes only maybe 8 to 10 feet deep and very little room. You really just can't put a whole lot of plants in those spaces. This is another thing that's in the document that I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit, is this concept that we came up with about having continuous front yard planting plan. If you go into these new developments and you see the houses are very close together, and if you look down the street, you might see 10, 15, even 20 homes all the way down the street. And the idea here is that all the front yards are planted as one continuous landscape all the way down the block. We call it a continuous braid of plants. And so that it has continuity and it's a unified design as you look down the street, and it's not all these little separate, different, tiny yards. And so we got this idea from, we call it the front line because it's in your front yard. And that's in honor of the High Line in New York and the Underline in Miami. And so here are the metrics for that. We are saying, again, tree canopy, 40% or more of that long linear park. Street trees every 30 feet apart in the verge, which is the strip between the sidewalk and the road. 75, what's going on here? 75% native and adapted plant mix. 80% of the plants are evergreen. And I'm looking at our boxes down here along the bottom. 90% drought tolerant. And then again, the number of species here. So those are the metrics that we have designated for that. There are 2 developers right now down in the Lake Nona area who are testing this idea of having this front line. And I haven't talked to them recently to see how things are going, but one of the key things here is on these frontline landscapes is they're having the same company who is maintaining all the landscapes all the way down. And they have told me that the maintenance is easier because, they know all the plant material. This is a very touchy screen here. Okay, so another thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, and we'll do this quickly, is form-based codes for walkable urban streets, because I want to show how these metrics can also work for an entire community and not necessarily just for landscapes. And I had to pull all this out of the archives. This is what I actually did, a study that I did for my dissertation years ago. And but when I was thinking about this, I thought, form-based codes would be a perfect example to show, and using form-based codes for walkable urban streets, because a lot of the high-performance landscapes are based on codes, are written into codes, the metrics that you use. So I was studying form-based codes, and if you don't know what they are codes that regulate the form of the street. So the visual qualities of the street and the spatial dimensions of the street corridor. And the advocates of form-based codes say this is a really great way to create a walkable urban street. When I was studying it, there was actually no research to show whether they actually did. It was just the advocates or the people who write these codes were saying that those streets would be walkable. So I went to a lot of these communities. All of them were in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's where the idea of form-based codes was born. And so there were a lot of small communities around the Bay Area that were mostly agricultural communities that were using these form-based code concept to help with the economic vitality of their small towns. And so I went and reviewed their form-based codes and walked their streets and used a survey that I did not write, but somebody else had written to measure all of these qualities on the street to see if they really were a walkable street. So somebody else has done the studies about what the design qualities that are important to walkability are, and they found that they can be defined, you can measure them, and you can quantify them. And so the whole idea of the form-based code is to regulate these measurable and quantifiable features, and they also can be shown in these codes. And here's another image from a code kind of showing what that walkable street might look like and what are some of those elements in the street. So this urban design qualities, which they call UDQ, urban design quality models, were identified in a research by Reed Ewing, and he had a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which gives grants for making healthier communities. And they came up, they have a document, a final report, and it's called Identifying and Measuring Urban Design Qualities Related to Walkability. And then they have a field manual that guides people in how to do this. So these are the models that they said: imageability, enclosure, if the street is human scale, if it has transparency, and if it has complexity. And so I'm going to give you some examples of each of those urban design qualities. And here's just some pictures from a couple of the streets that I visited. The one on the right-hand side is a street in Palo Alto that actually goes to Stanford University. And the other one, I think, was in Healdsburg, just north of San Francisco. So, imageability. That just means how memorable was that street? And I'm sure all of you have gone to a small town or even a large city and you've walked down a street and you remember that street for whatever reason. It was just interesting or fun to walk down, a lot of things to do. And so it's just memorable. The landscape in particular is memorable. So some of the features that you will see on a memorable street would be if there's little courtyards, little plazas, little pocket parks, place to sit and rest for a minute, to hang out. Then up here, historic building facades that are very interesting with a lot of detail, buildings that are not rectangular in shape, so they really stand out as some kind of cool architecture. And then the other one was a lot of outdoor dining possibilities. And by that, we don't mean just, a couple chairs and little tables outside, but some real true outdoor dining. Here's one that actually has white tablecloths. And those places that shows ability for social gathering. The other one is enclosure. And enclosure are those elements that help define the street so that you feel like you are in a well-defined space, a room, for example. So awnings and overheads are something that is recommended, not just for the enclosure aspect, but also protection if it starts to rain and so forth. Having sight lines, looking all the way down a street and having something at the end that you can see. You can barely see in this picture here, if you look all the way down the street, that's San Francisco Bay that you can see at the end there. And then street walls. And street walls can come in many forms. It can be, for example, the planter edges along there. It is the trees, the street trees, that's an implied wall. And it can be the literal walls of the buildings that create this little protected corridor. Street trees are important for their canopy overhead. They give this feeling of enclosure and protection. And some of the other street features, like the width of the sidewalk, are also important. Human scale. So that one's pretty easy to measure. It's elements that match the size of the humans, and kind of proportionately it fits in with, human size. And things like planters, for example, little decorative planters. This planter here represents the bottom half of an egg, because one of the cities I went to was Petaluma, and they're the egg capital of the world. And so they have planters all along their streets that resemble these eggs. Street furniture that is comfortable to sit in, could be benches, it could be seat walls and so forth, and windows and facade details. So the windows have, you can see into a space, but the facade details and the wall details like tile and, other things like that, that you can really get up close and look at and enjoy the detail of it. Transparency is another one. And transparency is the ability to see in to a building and see what's happening in the building, and also having windows and doors so that people that are inside the building can look out and see what's happening out on the street. And this gives people a feeling of safety, eyes on the street, knowing that people can see them and they can see in the building. There's nothing worse than walking down a street and having a building that's a blank wall, and you just see doors, but you don't even know what's happening in that building. And also seeing activity inside the building tells us there's things we can do here on the street. And then in between the blocks, maybe having secret little courtyards, a little way you can cut between the blocks. I found that fountains were very popular to use for that. And then complexity. Complexity is the variety of elements that you have, or the visual variety in the environment, because we like to see a lot of different things. We don't want to be in a boring place. So public art is one way to get a lot of variety. So a variety of elements like this circular arbor here with the fountain in the middle, which happened to be in the middle of a roundabout. And this was in the town. I think all these pictures were taken in a small town of Livermore, just outside of Berkeley. And it's mostly famous for the Lawrence Livermore Lab that UC Berkeley has there, but it's a cow town. It's famous for their rodeos. And so things like distinct buildings and different building colors and so forth. Most of these, or quite a few of these codes, are either to redo a historic street, like the historic main street of a town, or to, on other streets where there might be just plain old strip malls, or just, a not very attractive street, to put in new buildings that have all of these kind of facade details and so forth that the form-based codes recommend. So then I took this street survey. Of course, somebody else had, Reed Ewing had developed this survey, and went to all these different towns that had used form-based codes, but I also went to other towns that were well known for having a walkable street, so I could compare the two. And you just walk down the street and you count the number of, under imageability, for example, on this score sheet, you could count the number of courtyards and plazas and parks, the number of historic buildings, maybe number of buildings with identifiers, which are signs. And so you're just doing a count as you walk down. So it was actually, you know, in terms of research, a lot of fun. I actually took my mom with me, and in the morning we would go and we would walk down these streets and fill out all the score sheets. And then in the afternoon, we'd just hang out and go shopping or go to some place to eat and have fun. So real tough research there. But these codes also have street metrics, and they have, you know, what they recommend for the width of the sidewalks, like 10 feet on this one, 6 feet for a outer sidewalk that's not under the canopy, 6 feet verge where the street trees are, and then so on. And so these are the dimensions of the street that are really important. And studies have shown that to have a street be kind of enclosed and walkable and feel good, you shouldn't have over 100-foot right-of-way. And you want to keep the streets a little bit more narrow. So other things like the building height, the recommendations are at least a 2-story building, sometimes a 3-story building, and the use of awnings and so forth. And then many of them have metrics for the building facades. So this is an example from one of the codes, and it says, you know, if you're building a new building, it should have a cornice along the top. And they're mimicking the historic buildings like the one in the picture here, that there should be a lot of fenestration, which is windows on the 2nd story, awnings on the bottom floor, and open windows with displays in them on the bottom floor, and then open like glass doors so you feel like you are welcome to come in. And most of these they will have in there how many windows you need to have, or they will say something like on your upper facade it needs to be 75% windows or glass or transparent, and on the bottom floor it needs to be 95% transparency or windows. They'll also usually include the streetscape and landscape metrics, so they might have a plant list on the actual types of plants that you need to use, the maximum heights of plants, and maybe seasonal color. So for example, usually on a street you want to have just low plants and high plants because there is this gap that you need to have vision to be able to see the traffic on the street, especially if you're pulling out of a parking lot or something. And some of them will just go and say, I want it to be very colorful. Others say, I want to use all native plants. So the landscape might look very different from these different codes. And then, so in the end, on my research, I actually came up with some recommendations to say that if you are going to write a form-based code, these are the things that you should make sure you include in the code if you want to make sure that you're going to have walkable streets. And so one of them was to regulate a high total number of features. So you should have benches, you should have planters and signs and glass storefronts and street trees and so forth. The other thing is to regulate the frequency of the features in a set distance. So you might pick like 1 block or 3 blocks or whatever and say, okay, in a 3-block distance, you need to have 20 street trees, or you need to have 10 benches, or you need to have X number of planters. And so it would be not only the number of features, but the frequency of them in a certain distance. And also have in your codes a high number of those features that are linked to your models, to these urban design quality models. The best ones to pay most attention to, make sure you include features that are linked to imageability, complexity, and human scale. Those are the most important for walkability. And in your codes, you should be most prescriptive with building materials and the colors, the facade, the street furniture, and the spatial dimensions of the street. So I wanted to show you these to show that a high-performing landscape is not always just the plant material, but it is everything else in that landscape that creates that environment that you're in. So last slide here. Performance standards can be written as landscape pattern books. And here's a couple in the center here that I have written. And then also the one for the villages that you see over on the left. Jen Marvin, actually, from the Florida Friendly Program, actually helped write that document. Some of them can be landscape guidelines for like neighborhood programs. I included here the city of Tampa down in the right-hand side. It's their Imagine 2040 comprehensive plan. And it's what they want Tampa to look like from a landscape, like their downtown places, their natural spaces, and so forth in 2040. It's full of performance standards and codes and guidelines. And so these comprehensive plans, which every city has, is actually a form of a performance standards written as codes. And then you can also look at other documents. This was a really great document that I'm familiar with from writing my book on urban ecology, and it's from Melbourne, the city of Melbourne, Australia, and it has biodiversity strategy and action plan guidelines. An excellent document on how municipal planning can have more biodiversity included in it. And I think that that is it. All right, and I've run out of time, I see. So perfect timing. So thank you, everyone. Questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Hansen, for a very thorough and well-needed presentation. We do have a few questions here in the Q&A section. Rebecca was kind enough to answer some of the access to materials questions regarding on where to find this presentation afterwards. So please be on the lookout for the links. But for you specifically, Gail, we have one question here that says, much of the available literature considering the performance metrics tends to be Northeast focused. Are there any Zone 10A specific literature that can benefit Florida in that specific region in 10A?
Actually, not that I know of. So when we wrote our document on performance standards there, our case study was for North Florida because it is in Yulee. And so we tried to write it to be pretty generic for Florida, kind of. So we didn't put a lot of examples for South Florida.
Okay.
It's fairly
Thank you,
easy
sir.
for us to write these for North and Central Florida because we're kind of similar. But when you get down to South Florida, it is a different, you need some different metrics down there.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Hansen.
Mhm.
We have a next question here regarding pest management, considering mosquitoes and other invasive insects. Are there any design strategies or features that can be integrated to support this performance metric?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that in terms of a metric for a design metric would be obviously to not have plants that might capture and hold still water in the yard, or have a low area in the yard that holds water for more than 3 days. That's what most of the stormwater, that's what they advocate, that it has to drain, perk down within 3 days so mosquitoes don't have an opportunity to lay eggs there. But then from a maintenance standpoint, it's the same advice that you get all the time is, make sure you don't have containers like bird baths and stuff like that that hold water. I can't think of really anywhere I've seen it written in terms of a performance metric, except to say that if you can kind of keep track of how many mosquitoes problems you have in your yard, then do all these different design, and maintenance things, and then test and go out and see, count how many mosquitoes were landing on your arm before you did this, then do all these design measures and go out and see if you have less mosquitoes on your arm. I really don't know, but that's really just the number of mosquitoes is probably the only metric I can think of off the top of my head right now.
Thank you. Thank you for that response, Dr. Hansen. We have another question here that says, in developments with continuous landscaping across multiple properties, how
Mhm.
do you handle situations where homeowners resist following the prescribed design, especially with owner turnovers?
So it is in the code that the owner cannot change anything in their front yard. They can do whatever they want in their backyard. So I would say, that the owner is, it's very similar to an HOA code that doesn't allow you to, for example, put little garden gnomes out in your front yard, or, certain plants and everything. So it is that is part of the landscape code. Um, that idea that everyone has similar planting all along the front of the yard. I've heard that it really helps with maintenance because the maintenance crew is familiar with the plant schedule, the plants that are in there, and it's easier for them to maintain everybody's yard instead of having to know about many different plants because everybody's yard has different plants in it. So it's really not that much different from an HOA that they would get a notice and they would say, you can't dig up these plants in your yard and put your own plants in. You can do whatever you want in your backyard, but it's not allowed, basically. And would get a notice, and if they persist, they would probably get a notice that they'll be fined if they, remove that landscape and do their own thing.
Thank you for that. And then we're gearing towards the last two questions here. This attendee has lower petalum shrubs that are not attracting wildlife. Could there be a reason for this? Also, three of them are growing well, but one is not. What can be the cause of differences between these four different shrubs? Four of the same variety, but they're
Yeah.
performing differently, right?
Um, so I'm not an expert on it was loropetalum that you said?
Yes.
Okay. Um, you know, I, I don't know that loropetalum are generally good pollinator shrubs. I have never really noticed a lot of pollinators, and somebody else who has more knowledge of specifically these plants, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never noticed them to be really high butterfly or bee attracting shrubs. So if you planted them with the idea that you would have more pollinators, it may have just been the wrong plant. It's not a plant that is normally known as a pollinator attractor. Um, and, as to plants that are not doing well. Some of them are doing well and some not. It's really crazy. Sometimes you can have plants that are only a few feet apart, but the conditions for one plant might be slightly different based on the soil. And maybe there's a little bit more clay, a clay pocket in one area, and there's standing water there. It doesn't drain as well, so the plants don't do as well there, and literally can only be a few feet apart from another area where the plant is located. That was a huge problem in the wildlife community where we were working. They had really terrible soil because they brought in a lot of fill dirt from 3 different borrow pits, and a lot of plants were failing. And that was one of the reasons why we were called in to help them with so
Thank you.
hopefully somebody who has more specific knowledge on laurel petalum can help the person who was asking that question.
Thank you. And then that takes us to this last one here. We have a comment, which is not a question. And Sherry says, one of my favorite and memorable towns in the historic downtown of Fernandina Beach in Northeast Florida. They did a fantastic job with their street metrics. They also created greenways that run north and south of the area with are all also walkable and bike rideable. An incredible amount of animals, which we are thrilled to see. A great example more towns should incorporate into their urban settings. Thanks for another amazing webinar, Sherry.
Well, and actually, Sherry, I believe that Fernandina Beach has form-based codes that they use. They developed a set of form-based codes for helping to do some of the design of their street. So great. Yeah, I've been there and it is great. A great street to walk down. Loved it.
And then just on a final thought, Dr. Hansen, how if the audience did not get a chance to ask their questions or get their questions answered, if they're interested in exploring additional resources or have additional questions, how can they get in contact with you specifically?
They can just send me an email directly. It's ghansen@ufl.edu. And I'd be happy to tackle any question or, any help with finding resources or anything. So just email me directly.
Thank you for that. And Rebecca just posted Dr. Hansen's email in the chat for everyone's access. Thank you again, everyone, for joining this webinar, this professional webinar. Thank you, everyone, including Dr. Gail Hansen, for an amazing topic, and Tom and Rebecca as well for being the moderators of this webinar. And we approached nearly 200 attendees for today, so this is a successful webinar session. Again, just a reminder, this will be posted via the webinar website links via the FFL channel, so please be on the lookout for that. I know we did get a couple questions, and participants were asking about how to access this presentation. So this is recorded and will be packaged, and we are asking about a week or two for us to get the videos in package order before communicating that to the public. Thank you so much for everyone's time.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, take care.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.